Greetings, booktubers. Welcome back to Grammaticus Books. And today at Grammaticus Books, we're talking about Casca the Eternal Mercenary in general, and specifically, we're talking about the 11th book in the series, Casca the Legionnaire, written by Barry Sadler, first published in 1984. This is a first printing of the paperback version of it by Charter Adventure Books. I think they have their own publisher to distribute these books. Now, Casca the Eternal Mercenary, if you're not familiar with the Casca series, the main character, Casca Rufio Longinus, the backstory to him is he was a Roman soldier in Judea back at the turn of the millennium, 2 millenniums ago to be precise. And one night he's pulled guard duty on Golgotha. And as he's on guard duty in Golgotha, the centurion in charge of his unit comes up to him and orders him to hasten the deaths of the prisoners that have been crucified on top of the hill. So he takes his spear and he stabs the first prisoner in the ribs in order to get him to bleed out quicker. And the prisoner looks down, makes eye contact with him, and says, "Soldier, for I can see that that's what you are, and you're content being a soldier. I therefore curse you to wander the earth as a soldier until we meet again." And of course, it's Jesus Christ that he's stabbed in the side with the spear of destiny. And now he has been cursed to wander the earth as a soldier forever until the second coming of Christ. And it's a bit of a brilliant literary tool that the author Barry Sadler employs here with Casca the Eternal Mercenary. And again, this is book 11, because now it allows him to take his character who he can maintain continuity with the readers, and he can move Casca all around the globe to all different conflicts, to all different countries and nationalities and armies at all different times, and write about all of these different wars through the eyes of Casca Rufio Longinus. And that, in fact, is what he does here, writing about the Battle of Dien Bien Phu and a lot of the period leading up to it here with the French Foreign Legion in Indochina in the 1950s. And this is the perfect subject for Barry Sadler to write about, because Barry Sadler was Staff Sergeant Barry Sadler of the United States Army Special Forces Green Berets, who fought in Vietnam for a number of years behind enemy lines, training indigenous forces in the highlands of Vietnam, where he was severely wounded. And after he was severely wounded fighting against the North Vietnamese army, he came out and he invents his Casca hero here in 1979. And then he puts him into these books. So he knows Vietnam, he knows Indochina, he knows the Viet Minh and the NVA intimately in a way that almost no other author possibly could. And he writes about that and the soldiers fighting in them here in the French Foreign Legion and Casca the Legionnaire, with just exquisite detail, insight, and authenticity that you're rarely going to find anywhere else. It's an excellent, excellent military adventure action novel that Barry Sadler writes here. Now, the series of Casca the Eternal Mercenary, it starts with Casca number 1, the Eternal Mercenary, and they wound up writing over 50 of these novels. And in fact, they started ghostwriting them because Barry Sadler died in 1988. He was down in Central America, probably, in my opinion, working for the CIA while he was still writing these books. And he was probably, again, in my opinion, shot in the head by an assassin in Guatemala City and killed. He survived. He was shot in 1988. He was severely wounded. He survived for a number of years after that, but he was never the same, obviously, after taking a bullet in the head, and then he died shortly after. But before that happened, we had the fortune for him to write this book here, which is an excellent military action adventure novel. It's not the most eloquently written novel in the world. Barry Sadler was a high school dropout, but that doesn't mean that he was unintelligent. He was a highly intelligent guy. He taught himself to write, and he was certainly writing all types of action reports and formal reports in the Army, who taught him how to structure a sentence in a paragraph. But they didn't teach him how to be a novelist, so you get some rough transitions. His writing style is very brusque. It's very short and curt, but it does suit the novel here. It gives it sort of a kinetic action to it, a velocity to it that drives the story through the pages of this book here. And it is it's just a page turner. I could not put this book down. I enjoyed it immensely. The Casca Eternal Mercenary series, like I said, it's over 50 books. Probably the first 10 to 12 of them were written by Sadler, and then after that, it's questionable. Of those first 10 to 12 books, the ones that are always hailed as being the best in the series is number 1, Casca the Eternal Mercenary. The next one you get is Casca number 4, the Panzer Soldier, is highly praised. I've read this book, I've reviewed this book on the channel. It is a very good book, Casca the Panzer Soldier. And then the other book that you get high praise for in the series is this one right here, Casca the Legionnaire. I just finished this book. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. It's not the most smoothly written book in the world, but it is a page turner. I couldn't put it down. It just has an absolute velocity on the pages of the book that drives the story forward to the end and takes you in and doesn't let you go. Just grabs you, pulls you into Indochina with the French Foreign Legion, and it's a great ride of a story. It's got its serious parts in here, but Barry Sadler was a guy who enjoyed the military. He enjoyed soldiers. He had no illusions about what war was about, but he also took enjoyment in fighting and in the action and being with the soldiers and having that camaraderie with them. And that is what clearly comes through in this book right here, Casca the Legionnaire. Now, Casca the Legionnaire, chronologically in the history of Casca Rufio Longinus, comes directly after this soldier here, Panzer Soldier, which was number 4 in the series. And Panzer Soldier, Casca is now going by the name of Karl Langer. He's in charge of a panzer crew fighting on the Eastern Front. As they're retreating back, he winds up at the end of this book in Hitler's bunker in Berlin as the Russian army is closing in. I won't give away the ending of this book, but it's delicious. So this book picks up in the bunker in Berlin at the end of the war, right where that book, Panzer Soldier, leaves off. And Casca is coming out and he's escaping from Berlin as the Wehrmacht is in complete collapse as the Russians close in. And as he's escaping, he's picked up by the French forces. Him, along with thousands of other German prisoners of war, are gathered in by the French, and they are given an ultimatum by the French. They can join the French Foreign Legion, where they will be given a new identity. Their past will be cleared. All their past crimes or history will be cleared off the plate. And once they complete their term of service, they will be given French citizenship. Then they can take that offer, or they can be turned over to a prisoner of war camp and processed. And if they've committed any war crimes, obviously, at that point, they're going to be prosecuted for war crimes. So not surprisingly, a large number of these German soldiers at the end of the war that were in the hands of the French do wind up in the French Foreign Legion. And why, would you ask, would the French, who'd just been fighting a world war against the Germans who occupied their country for almost 4 years in a very harsh occupation, offer amnesty and take these German soldiers into their army? Because they desperately needed men to fight for them in Indochina, where they were facing an increasingly strong opponent in the Viet Minh, who were being supplied by the Red Chinese Army and making their hold of that country of Indochina as one of their colonial properties more and more difficult. And this is a solution to their manpower needs, because they cannot institute a draft right after the end of World War II, after their nation of France is just battle and war weary. The last thing in the world that the French government wants to do is institute a draft. So here's a solution to their manpower problems. And this, in fact, did actually occur with the French, taking large numbers of Germans, including Waffen-SS people and officers and soldiers, because they were the perfect people to take in, their battle-hardened troops, and ship them over to France to fill their manpower needs. And that's where this book picks up, with Karl Langer then going over as a French Foreign Legionnaire, escaping the Russians in his past as a German panzer soldier, and fighting in Indochina. Now, 3/4 of this book are not the siege of Dien Bien Phu. It's leading up to the siege of Dien Bien Phu, and this, the very end of this book, is the infamous siege of Dien Bien Phu, where the French were finally overrun by several divisions of Viet Minh, again supplied by the Chinese with heavy weaponry. Dien Bien Phu was a bid by the General Navarre of the French staff in charge of the French forces in Indochina to place this airhead all the way up in the northwest corner of Indochina in order to cut off the Viet Minh's supplies of opium in that valley that they were using in order to finance their war and their rice supplies, and to draw the Viet Minh into them in a conclusive and decisive battle. But he didn't reckon on not having enough aircraft to supply his troops and this airhead that they set up, and he did not reckon that he was going to be fighting several divisions of well-supplied Viet Minh, including with heavy artillery pieces to shell the hell out of his airbase. And it's an absolute disaster. They're overrun after approximately 60 days of being under siege, and it's a complete military disaster. As are some of the most famous battles of the French Foreign Legion are actually defeats, as is this one, but they fought heroically for 60 days. They inflicted massive casualties on the Viet Minh before being overwhelmed and having to surrender. And it's the battle, that battle, Dien Bien Phu, that leads to the UN then partitioning Indochina into North Vietnam and South Vietnam, which then, of course, leads eventually to US intervention directly in the war after the Gulf of Tonkin incident and US involvement for 10 years in the Vietnam War. So this is the prelude to Vietnam, seen through the eyes of Carl Longer as a French Foreign Legionnaire. It's a very good book. Like I said, it's a page turner. A lot of this book is the camaraderie of the soldiers in the French Foreign Legion. And in this book, Carl Longer is reunited with the one surviving tank crew member of his tank crew from Panzer Soldier, Gus Biederman. So he and Gus Biederman, who is an absolute character, I would almost call him comic relief, but it would be comic relief in the most grim and violent manner possible. So there are passages in this book where Gus Biederman, his surviving tank crew driver, and Carl Longer from his tank crew are in a bit of a war with their own sergeant who's trying to kill them, and they are trying to drive the sergeant insane. And there are passages in this book that just made me laugh out loud. And I haven't done that in a very long time. It's very grim, black humor. It's a very gritty book. It's a very rough book. It's a very unapologetic book that sort of revels in the violence of combat. When Carl Longer and Gus Biederman aren't fighting, they're either out getting rip-roaring drunk, stealing everything that can't be nailed down, or visiting houses of ill repute, which probably was what the French Foreign Legionnaires were doing. There wasn't a whole heck of a lot else to do in Vietnam, and as a French Foreign Legionnaire in that war. So you get that whole aspect of it. Barry Sadler doesn't turn his gaze away from the depredations of the Viet Minh, nor does he turn it away from the depredations of the French Foreign Legion and the occupying colonial forces of France in Vietnam at that time. He's fully aware of what was going on both sides. But to me, the best part of this book was the interaction between Carl Longer and a Viet Minh colonel who captures him in one of their engagements prior to Dien Bien Phu. And this colonel, who's in charge of organizing the resistance around Dien Bien Phu by General Giap, has decided that he wants to try to break Carl Longer through weeks and weeks of interrogation while they're holding him in this underground bunker in the north of Vietnam. And so he's trying to break Carl Longer, and he wants to convert Carl Longer over to his side eventually. They want to basically brainwash him. And there's an exchange between Carl Longer and this Viet Minh colonel that is absolutely priceless. To me, it was the best part of the book. It goes on for a while, and it really brings out Barry Sadler's view of the Viet Minh and what exactly he thought of them and what he thought of the Communist Party and what the communists were doing in Indochina, and comparing it with no blinders on, with no sunglasses shading his view as to what was going on with the French, but then comparing the depredations of the Viet Minh to those of the colonial French. And this colonel here, needless to say, is rather disappointed in his attempts to convert Carl Longer over to their cause. But it's an excellent book. I do recommend it. You can't talk about this book, though, without talking about another book called Devil's Guard that was written by George Elford back in 1971. Devil's Guard purported to be a nonfiction book where George Elford had met with a Waffen-SS colonel after the Vietnam War in Paris, France, where this Waffen-SS colonel relayed to him his story of being in the French Foreign Legion fighting in Indochina, where he had gathered an entire SS unit under the guise of French Foreign Legionnaires and was operating independently in Indochina. And that's what the book Devil's Guard is about. It's correct in the fact it was factual that they were working with and using German SS soldiers in Indochina, the French were, and then everything after that it's absolute fiction. There's not an ounce of truth to anything George Elford wrote past that point. And if you think that that's a factual book relating factual events, then I have a bridge to sell you in Brooklyn, because it's not real. But I thought I should mention it. Those books they're very closely related. But this is a much better book. It's a much more entertaining book. It doesn't purport to be anything other than it is, which is a military action adventure novel written with just a kinetic energy that gives it a velocity that won't let you put it down. And you'll read it through straight from start to finish and enjoy every page of it. And I do recommend it. And that's it. I'm going to wrap up my review there of Casca the Legionnaire number 11 by Barry Sadler and say take care, be safe, and I will catch you guys next time.